guys, so I'm here today to film my mid-month reading wrap-up for March. I have been doing sort of mid and end of month wrap-ups for a little while now just because I think I've been reading quite a lot in relative terms, and it gives me more space to review each book if I split these up into multiple videos, and also they're fresher in my mind, so I'm enjoying this system. However, I did film a reading vlog that you should have seen. It was the last video to go up for my readathon, The Femme Fatale, and some of these books I obviously talked about in that video because I was reading them for that vlog. However, I also read some other books, so I'm going to start with the books I didn't read during the readathon and then talk a little bit more in depth about the books I did read during the readathon, just so that I'm, you know, checking in about all those books even if you did see that video. So for the books I didn't read during the readathon, the first one is The Perilous Life of Jade Yeoh by Zen Cho. So this is my second work by Zen Cho, and it's another short work. So this one fell into the sort of 70-page category. I don't know if that's technically long enough to be a novella or it still sort of counts as more of like a long short story, but it was a little bit meatier than the previous short work I read by her, which was The Terracotta Bride. And in other ways it was quite different as well, because this one wasn't fantastical in any way, shape or form. It was a historical piece set in the 1920s in London, which was a lot of fun in itself. I do enjoy a little bit of a historical sort of contemporary comedy of manners almost. I don't know where to pinpoint this book. There's like a little bit of romance, but it doesn't feel like your traditional romance short story. There's obviously the historical setting. There's a lot of kind of like wit and clever humour in there, so there's just a lot going on, and I think it's just an example of Zen Cho's wonderful writing. She can obviously cross boundaries when it comes to genres, as the other work I read by her was definitely fantasy. It was set in a Chinese version of the underworld. And we follow Jade in this story, who moved to London a few years ago and has been making a living as a single, like, independent woman in London in the 1920s by writing, and particularly like writing reviews, and she contributes to a magazine that I think was called the Oriental Literature Review or something along those lines. She also writes for like women's magazines rather than necessarily being like a novelist. She contributes to like magazines and newspapers, and she has a really close relationship and friendship with the editor of the Oriental Literature Review. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it was called. It's sort of faded from my mind slightly already, the title of that magazine, but she's friends with him. They've got a really good relationship, and she has recently sort of been introduced to literary society after writing quite a scathing review of this author called Sebastian Hardy. However, Sebastian Hardy doesn't react to this review negatively. He reacts to this review with like intrigue and decides to pursue Jade, and they start up a love affair. But actually what's wonderful about this book, and this is always made pretty clear, is that it's not the story of a romance between Sebastian and Jade. Sebastian is married, although his like marriage is quite open and his wife knows about Jade. She's just attracted to him, interested in that side of life, so decides to sort of pursue an affair that is slightly outside of society's norms. However, her heart definitely lies elsewhere, and it's her diary entries of this affair, what happens afterwards, about the man that she truly loves, and just living in London, and it's so wonderful. I love this story. I love Zen Cho's writing. I don't know I find it difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is, but it just has the perfect tone, and I thought Jade was such an interesting and endearing character to follow, and I just loved everything about this little story, to be honest. We then have a book I didn't love quite as much, unfortunately, and that is Love Her or Lose Her by Tessa Bailey. This is the sequel to Fix Her Up, which was a contemporary romance I read at the beginning of this year and really enjoyed. I think it had a lot of like the fun, light-hearted jollies that I would look for in this genre, and I was really excited about book 2, which follows 2 minor characters from book 1, as each book follows like a new couple in a new romance, and for that reason I was already interested in them and I was somewhat invested in their relationship because I got to know a little bit more about their background. However, this book very much like grabbed a hold of all the things that weren't perfect about Fix Her Up and blew them up and made them more part of the story, and sort of lost some of the like fun, humour and like just like endearing qualities of book one. So I still sped through this. I didn't hate the reading experience. It was, again, just quite light-hearted, easy reading, but I found myself constantly a little bit irritated by the story and the characters, so that would take me out of it and just make me care less about how it got on for them. In fact, I didn't really feel that invested in the relationship, which is a little bit odd because for these two characters, they have a long history. This is a married couple who have trouble in their marriage. They basically only have a physical relationship at this point. They still have sex, but they don't communicate, they don't talk, they don't know what's going on with each other in their like personal lives, they don't support one another emotionally the way that they need to, and this is their sort of last ditch attempt at saving their marriage. However, the more and more the book goes on, I really just wasn't convinced that there was anything other than physical attraction to their relationship, so it was really hard to sort of think, yes, you guys can do this, you can like make it through with like a bit of therapy, because it kind of just felt like maybe sex was all they had. The inner monologue of both the characters is, I would say, 70% superficial. So the way they think about their partner and the sort of like thoughts that we get to see as a reader always seem to come back to the sexual relationship, the way the other person looks, how attracted they are to one another, and that seemed to be so much the focus that it just became a little bit eye-roll worthy and hard to believe there was more to that relationship. And something that a lot of readers may also not really get on with is how like me Tarzan, you Jane, this relationship is. I think, yeah, there is a tendency for romance to fall into that category from what I've read, and there's like a little bit of like that in book one, but it feels quite light-handed, and it always felt like Georgie still like held her own and it wasn't like an unequal relationship. But this book just didn't quite manage to balance that as well, and like I mentioned, just felt like full-blown me Tarzan, you Jane, which isn't really as much my cup of tea. So I just couldn't get into this one as much and just didn't quite love it as much, unfortunately. I'm still looking forward to book 3 though, because it's about a third character who I've learned loads about in the past 2 books, and I think her relationship dynamic will be so interesting to read about. But I also think kind of how I've reacted to this book seems to be quite common based on the Goodreads reviews that I've read. So just a heads up if you loved Fixer Up for what you might be in for with book 2. I then read another book which was a sequel, which is Restless Slumber by KJ Sutton. This is a sequel to Fortuna Sworn, which I literally only just read. I read book 1 and wrapped it up in my last wrap up, so I kind of read these ones back to back as it were. There might be like one book in between, but I felt invested enough after book 1 that I wanted to find out what was next for our characters in book 2. Now this is more of an urban fantasy series, and book 1 was set much more in the magical world of the Fae, whereas book 2 returns to the contemporary world and does sort of fully immerse itself in that urban fantasy backdrop, which isn't my favourite kind of fantasy. Not to say there aren't great urban fantasies out there, I just think I prefer a fantasy book set in a more like historical or like fantastical setting than necessarily urban fantasy. But I did very much enjoy exploring that genre with these books. Now obviously I don't want to say too much about the plot of book 2, so if you didn't see my review for book 1, it's about a young woman who is a nightmare, which is a magical creature that can sort of touch other human beings, well, any creature really, including like fairies for example, find out what their greatest fears are, what their nightmares are, and use them against them, like create illusions in their mind that can be used as a weapon. And her brother has been missing for a couple of years now, until a fairy man turns up with information on where her brother might be and offers to help her find her brother in exchange for her marrying him. Now like I said, book 2 was much more urban fantasy. There was a lot of like werewolves in this book, and that's just like not my favourite thing when it comes to fantasy. There is also a like graphic rape scene, which I just think you should be prepared for going into, because personally I like to know if that's coming. And I know you could talk about those kind of things as like spoilers, but I'm not really sure if like things like sexual violence should be just casually used as plot devices that you depend on the like narrative of your book for to be surprising. I don't know if I articulate that well, and I'm not saying the author is doing that at all, but that's why I don't really consider it a spoiler to tell you, because a good book doesn't depend on that being a spoiler to be a good book, if you see what I mean. So I'm kind of always going to flag that up, and I prefer to have it flagged up myself. But overall, if you're into urban fantasy, this one's super fast paced, got some interesting like characters and dynamics, and I will probably continue on with the series when book 3 comes out. We then have the books I read for the Femme Fatales. So these were all supposed to be fantasy books written by women. However, I will say the first book I'm going to talk to you about turned out to stray more into science fiction than necessarily fantasy. It's, I guess, what you could call a speculative book, and you don't necessarily know from the initial premise whether it's going to be fantastical or scientifically explained. But it's a middle grade book, and that is A Place Called Perfect by Helena Duggan. This is about, of course, a place called Perfect, where our protagonist moves with her parents. Her dad is a world-renowned eye surgeon, and Perfect has a very specific need of his services because everybody in Perfect, for whatever reason, goes blind after you've spent some time there. I think our main characters literally go blind within one night of living in Perfect. However, you can see again once you get fitted with these rose-tinted spectacles that the local opticians make in this town. And weirdly, when you put these glasses on, everything looks even like a little bit more perfect than it did before. So clearly something strange is afoot, and our young protagonist, Violet, immediately becomes suspicious. The people around her are acting very strange, very perfect, and her mother is also changing in a way that she's not accustomed to. And it majorly gave me Stepford Housewives vibes. This is like the Stepford Housewives but for children. Like, that is the only way I can think to sum up this book. You know, family move to strange, perfect little town, and misbehaving children, even if they are just stepping slightly out of line or forced to behave according to that, like, town's strict societal ways, but nobody really talks about it, and it all seems so lovely and perfect and creepy. Just like the Stepford Wives. I think I said Stepford Housewives before, but it's the Stepford Wives, you know what I mean. Again, this was just another one that I kind of sped through super quickly. I ended up listening to the audiobook, and it was narrated really well. I think that this one has like a lot of imagination and like a good balance between like the levity of a children's book and a little bit of creepiness that I know as a child I still really enjoyed. So I can see this one being very popular amongst younger readers. And then I read the 6th book in a series, which is The Curse of the Troll by Emma Hamm. Like I mentioned, this is book 6 in a series, the Other World series. However, the books in this series can work sometimes as standalones and sometimes not as standalones. So to explain, books 1 and 2 in this series are one story arc with a specific set of protagonists. Book 3 is its own novel. So books 1 and 2 retold the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale as a like story arc. We then have book 3, which retells The Little Mermaid as like a solo story arc following new main characters. Then in books 4 and 5 we have another duology which retells the Swan Princess, I think it was. That's my favourite duology of the series. That's my favourite story arc of the series so far, I have to confess. However, those characters were side characters in book 1 and 2, and then book 6 is another standalone that retells East of the Sun and West of the Moon, the fairy tale. However, now having read more of the series, I think you want to read them in order, even though book 6 kind of could work as a standalone. You meet Elva, the protagonist of book 6, way back in book 1, and it's kind of nice to fully understand her background. Now, I think there's enough information in book 6 to read it as a standalone, but I just felt like I knew her better as a character and all the things that had happened to her because I'd met her in book 1, book 2, book 4 and book 5. So, you know, I had all that sort of background of her being a minor character in those stories. Now, Elva is one of the Seelie Fae. She's incredibly beautiful, but she's also got quite a traumatic past. She was in a very manipulative, abusive relationship, which has led her to sort of like go on a journey of self-discovery. She's kind of cut herself off. She lives on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, although this is set in like a kind of like non-stipulated ancient past where a group of female warriors live. So she sort of lives and trains with them. However, she has to take part in a sort of quest slash mission in this book to take up residency in this strange cursed ice castle where a bear lives. And this bear is our second protagonist and of course love interest, a dwarf who has been cursed to live as a bear. However, the curse changes slightly, so he is able to take his dwarven form at night time, and they have all these conversations, although they can't see each other in the dark, and they establish this bond. Now, I won't say any more than that. It of course retells a fairy tale, so in most ways follows that story arc, and it's about their relationship. Now, like I said, I think books 4 and 5 in the series are my favourites. I think I prefer the longer story arcs. This one was very short and quick. It's only like 200 something pages. It feels more like a novella than a full-length novel. So the pacing is just like really fast and everything happens really quickly, which also I think helps having the background of Elva, because you have that kind of footing rather than feeling like rushed through the story that you might if you read book 6 by itself. But I still think it's an enjoyable read. I also think it deals really well with discussions of consent, like personal boundaries, like past relationship trauma, like just communication and all of those kind of things that are necessities, and I really like to see those things discussed in books that have a romance element, which I think all of Emma Hamm's fantasy books do. They're very much like fantasy romance. They are like both of those genres, and I liked seeing that discussion there, so that was really positive, and I'm glad that she explored that. So those are my overall thoughts on Curse of the Troll. And then lastly, I read Akata Warrior by Nedia Corrifor, which is book 2 in a duology, so also the final book in a duology, which began with Akata Witch. Now this is a YA series that follows a teenager named Sunny who lives in Nigeria. Her parents raised her for the first few years of her life in America, so she's like Nigerian American, and then they moved back to Nigeria a few years before the events of book 1. And as she gets older, she discovers that she has magical powers, that she is one of the leopard people, which is what her branch of sort of magic practitioners call themselves in Nigeria, in her local community. And she becomes friends with 3 other young leopard people, 2 boys and a girl, which basically like makes up her class for learning their for learning their craft. Now Sunny has a different background from the other 3 because her parents aren't leopard people, whereas they all come from families who told them about who they were and their magic from a young age, whereas she's sort of been introduced to it quite late. However, despite being introduced quite late, it's also quite clear that she has a lot of innate power within her and a larger role to play in much like grander universal plans for what might happen in the future, and she's actually getting visions of quite a dark possible future that she may have to stop. Now book 1 has a bit of like a serial killer thriller element to it, because someone is using witchcraft to go around killing children in sacrificial rites, and they have to help kind of solve that mystery. Now that aspect of it has pretty much closed up after book 1, so book 2 is slightly different and doesn't really have that kind of like mystery thriller element to it. I don't know if thriller is the right word, but you know what I mean from what I've just said. It's just slightly more about like the magical beings that are out there and learning more about their craft and stopping any potential like evil magic from entering into their world. I quite like the mystery aspect of book 1, so I did miss that a little bit in book 2, but I still really enjoy all these characters. I think Nedia Corrifor is an incredible writer. She creates such interesting worlds and like complex characters within them that have a lot of different sides to them, and I really enjoy the dynamics between Sunny, her 3 friends, and then some of the more like sideline characters, which are a lot of fun. There's like a real balance between sort of big scary magical things going on and also a bit of sort of like dating drama between her friend and her brother, and I quite like that kind of balance of things, and not ignoring those aspects of being a young person and sort of suddenly mature beyond your age in a way. Like I feel throughout these books that Sunny and her friends are still very much like just quite young teenagers and they always feel that way. They don't feel like adults in children's bodies, which I always think is sometimes a little bit weird when literature does that. So I enjoyed that. I love the rich details of this magic system, and I think all in all it's a really fantastic duology. I really don't read a lot of duologies, I have to say, but they are really nice. There's something really satisfying about a duology. I think it's like a really excellent length for a series to be. I mean, obviously it depends entirely on the series, but I think I'd like to read more duologies because I just think they work well for me as a reader, I guess. So those are all the books I've read so far in March. I'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on these, if you've read any of these books or any books by these authors and want to recommend me some more or just chat more generally about them. There is so many things here that I would love to have deeper conversations with you guys about, so please do leave your comments down below. And until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you again soon. Bye guys!